Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of our course Introduction to the Achaemenids, the last session of the course. I know, I would spend 600 more sessions speaking of the Achaemenids, but alas, all good things come to an end. For our last shebang, I wanted to do something a little different. We have been focusing on the Achaemenids and their importance in the ancient past, but what and how has survived to our days. And I am not speaking about archaeological findings. I am referring to what survives in modern media, in pop culture. How do we perceive the Achaemenids today? To illustrate our last session, I gathered different examples from different media, video games, films, and comics. And for that, I had the pleasure to interview some of the artists behind them. Special thanks must go to David del Castillo, author of The Immortal Asadi, to Mahur Purqadim, artist of the Seventh Sky universe, and Pariya Gourmand, artist of the Eskandar and Bagawas comic. All of them gave kindly the art to be featured in this presentation. They allowed me to use their images, and for that I am grateful. And they also gave me the chance to talk to them about what inspired their processes and creations. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. I think for these modern day era, you cannot talk about the Achaemenids in modern media and not mentioning this comic plus the film, which is the 300. The 300 is not originally a film, but a comic that originated from a different film made in 1962, and to cut them some slack, their intention was never to be historically accurate. This is a retelling of the story of the Battle of Thermopylae in a very much fantasy-oriented and very creative way, because there's this Western and fantasized view of the Achaemenids. Nothing is historically accurate, although the art of the comic and later the art of the film would take some elements of the Achaemenid visuals and Achaemenid jewelry, for example, to create their own and their own stories. But definitely this is not how the Achaemenids looked like. And also something very important to say is that the comic is consciously inaccurate because the comic responds to a very specific agenda and a very specific will that was the authors and the artist's intention to choose pay homage to a film that from the 60s that they loved very much, and just they thought the story was amazing and cool. But I unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because this is such a good ride, this is what comes to our mind when we think about the 300, the Battle of Thermopylae, and the Greco-Persian Wars. However, it is a product, as any could be. Its intention was never to be historically accurate, but I think it's a first step, it's a good step to dive into the imaginary ancient part of the Achaemenids. And I just had to put it because I enjoyed the film as much as the next person, but yeah, we shall not forget that this was never supposedly historical. This is more of a critique to the next example, which is the DLC available within the game Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Assassin's Creed is a lineage of video games that pride themselves, especially the latest titles, in their research and diving into the historical discourse and that good reenactment of history. However, these DLC is part of the Odyssey, which is set in ancient Greece, and it is true that the Greek part of the narration shows a lot of research and a very deep diving into the Greek culture at the time. However, not so much so happens with this DLC that tells the story of supposedly Xerxes I and Artaxerxes I. The story is absolutely not historical, and the representation of the Achaemenid Empire ideologically is terrible, is very, very westernized, very orientalistic, and in my personal opinion, pays little favor to whatever the intention was behind this DLC, because for example, the King Xerxes is presented as neurotic, chaotic, unstable, and a very big threat, which of course for the Greeks it was at one point. But if you are priding yourself in creating a saga of games that are quote unquote accurate to the historical discourse, you must have better researched a little bit, because not even the characters are presented accurately. Again, this is a game and it's fantasy, yes, but it's a game that pretends, or at least part of their aim is to be historical. And the story could be modified, of course, but to me, the most preoccupying thing is that the Orientalism within the discourse of the game presents yet once more Greece as the epitome of civilization and the basis of the Western culture, whereas the Orient, or the others, those being the Achaemenids, are presented and introduced as barbaric, again unstable, and very, very dangerous. So, you know, they could have done much better. And this is where we move to comics, starting with Tahte Javidan, which literally means the immortal throne. That's a comic by Horak Studios that presents the story of Iskandar after the burning of Persepolis. And this is a mix between history, fantasy, reality. It's very much oniric in one sense, because Iskandar does a lot of travels to the world of dreams and has a lot of visions when he is kind of repenting what has happened and going over the whole history of the Achaemenids. Something that really caught my attention was that not only Persepolis, but also the historical artifacts are presented in a state of ruin, but not in a detrimental way, but they are presented in the state that today we preserve them. For example, the Cyrus cylinder or some of the ruins at Persepolis, they are almost like pictures of today's state of the piece, and I think it's very interesting. I don't know if they chose to do so in order to connect this modern audience to something that was a little bit more relatable. I like the Immortal Asadi because it focuses on a part that we have a lot of doubts about, but it would be very interesting to explore narratively and especially historically. And this is the rise of Darayabush to power after the assassination of Cambyses. So the Immortal Asadi is a fictional tale, and there's a lot of creative liberty regarding the aspect of them. And I had the opportunity to talk to David del Castillo, who is the main script director and who had the idea of this character Asadi, who is an immortal serving Cambyses during the reign, or well, the rise to power to Darayabush. And then the character must choose what to do and who to follow and who to obey, because after all, he is a loyal soldier. There is a lot, as I was saying, creative liberty regarding the artistic side. And when I talked to David about this, he expressed that he wanted to create something that was familiar to the eye. And specifically, we were talking about the masks of the immortals. We don't know if the immortals ever certainly wore masks. It's a possibility. But he created this character to give the vibes. I don't know if you guys play Overwatch, but sort of Reaper, that character from Overwatch, or the Punisher from Marvel Comics, because again, this is a fictional tale, doesn't intend to be historical, and wanted to just show a little bit of the legacy of the Achaemenids and the importance of this very obscure period of time that is the rise to power to Dara, because we only have the official tale, and that, is the one that I wrote in the Heistone inscription. So he thought it would be very interesting to explore this holes in the discourse that we have. I won't deny that I'm very excited to bring you this character. His name is Uruk, and he's part of the narrative universe, the Seventh Sky. He's a creation of Mahur Purkadim and Sadaf Faqih, and I am just delighted because I met Uruk couple of years ago during the pandemic, along with all his friends from this narrative universe. And I really, really caught my attention because he was clearly showing the aspect of an Achaemenid warrior, specifically the jewelry. And of course, I had to ask. I had the opportunity to interview Mahur for this, Khaili Mamnoon Azizam. And in this universe, she was explaining that there is this Achaemenid afterlife because the seventh sky is a universe that occurs in the afterlife, and all the parts of history have their own atmosphere, we could say. And in this Achaemenid afterlife, there is Persepolis, there's the Achaemenid Empire, and the ruler is none other than Jamshid, the mythical king. I cannot spoil that any more for you, but Uruk is a very well-researched character from both artistic sources, historical papers, and especially coins, because his profile is based on an Iranian coin. And he is in Spasarka, you know, the eyes and ears of the king. He's a special soldier. We could call it a spy, but, you know, this is what he's conveyed to do. Mahur and Sadaf wanted to bring a space, to have a little space for the representation of the Achaemenid legacy and culture in the comic, because this is not something that is widely explored on media, and they feel it very interesting and offers great possibilities, something that I share. And despite the tale being fantastic in an alternate narration of completely unrelated events, in the sense that this is not historical reconstruction of the Achaemenid Empire and Uruk is only a little part of a greater universe, there is a lot of details, starting from Uruk's garment. He's wearing, well, he has sort of a scar on his chest, the prayer of Dara on the inscription of the Hishtun. That is something that I caught when I saw the images and I really liked it. And they wanted to bring to attention something as important as the Achaemenids and so little known to the general public. And this could be the first step for many people into getting to know the Achaemenids, and you know, what they are important, what the main aesthetics are, especially linked to buildings and pieces of gold in the case of Uruk. And they wanted to bring this into a wider audience and not people only interested in Iran or only interested in the history of the Achaemenids per se, but in a shape of a comic, having a character that embodies these Achaemenid legacy brings this widespread of information to a much easier level. And something similar occurred with Pariya Gourmand and Kamyab Ghurbanpur, who are the creators of this comic that still they're working on it. It's a work in progress, about Bagoas and Eskandar. If you don't know Bagoas, he was a young eunuch when Eskandar conquered over Babylon and Persepolis, and he entered the service of the Macedonian king, and they are introducing the story from the viewpoint of Bagoas. Pariya and Kamyab also felt like there was a lack of representation of ancient Iran in mass media and modern media, and they wanted to change that, especially since getting Eskandar as the first, having Eskandar as the first step was something that would bring the attention to people that was already interested in the ancient past and already interested in the history of Greece, so they could learn about the Achaemenids through the eyes of Eskandar, the same way that historically occurred. This comic is a little bit less fantastic and much more history oriented, and Pariya, who also I had the opportunity to interview, Khaili Mamnoon Azizam, she explained to me how they were using art as a major source for inspiration and research, especially regarding the clothing. As Mahur also explained and expressed from her and Sadaf, Pariya and Kamyab felt that they could do a great favor to people into introducing the history and the legacy of ancient Iran to the general public, something that is not that explored and could be equally interesting and equally fascinating, since there's a lot of people that enjoy historical tales or fantasy retellings but set in a historical background. And the most interesting part of their work is that they are presenting the Iranians through the eyes of a Macedonian who is a foreigner, and he is discovering these past. Although I must say Eskandar was very well educated, But he's discovering all of these via not only Vagoas, but his stay in the previous Achaemenid Empire. And I think that is fascinating. And honestly, I hope this comic, both comics are released soon, because I can't wait to read them. And that will be all for today's session and for our course. Thank you so much for accompanying us through the journey of discovering but a wee bit of the wonders of the Achaemenid dynasty. This has been Plumas, aka Laura, and it has been my greatest pleasure being your guide through these 6 sessions. Thanks again to Save Cultural Heritage Group for allowing this to happen, for the opportunity, and as always, have yourselves a beautiful day, Butcher. We will see each other soon. Khodafis!